In honor of Part 9/11, here are the most morbid facts I've ever posted about 9/11. In 1983, professional climber Dan Goodwin illegally climbed the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He said he was trying to bring attention to the inability to rescue trapped occupants of the upper levels of skyscrapers. In August of 2001, actor James Woods reported 4 suspicious men on his flight, but authorities didn't take his claims seriously. Turns out there were 4 of the hijackers who would go on to crash into the World Trade Center, and this was one of their test runs. Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shah Massoud warned about a major terrorist attack that was about to happen on U.S. soil, but he ended up being assassinated just 2 days before 9/11. An FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill urged the federal government to take the threat of Al-Qaeda more seriously, but he was eventually pushed into early retirement due to disagreements with the Bureau. He went on to head security at the World Trade Center, where he was killed on 9/11. Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg were both booked to fly on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. But Wahlberg decided last minute to fly to Toronto instead, while MacFarlane missed the flight by 10 minutes due to a hangover. Released in June of 2000, video game Deus Ex didn't include the World Trade Center in its skyline due to technical limitations. The in-game explanation was that they were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In August of 2000, the band Dream Theater recorded a live studio album called Live Scenes from New York. The album cover art features the New York City skyline with the Twin Towers on fire. Most disturbingly, the album was quickly pulled from shelves after coincidentally being released on September 11, 2001. Only one non-military plane was allowed to fly after all commercial flights were forced to land. It was delivering anti-venom to a snake handler in Florida who was bitten by the highly venomous taipan snake. Sculptor Michael Richards was killed in his art studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower on 9/11. His art ironically focused on planes, including a sculpture of airplanes piercing a cast of his own body. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. The only off-duty NYPD officer who was killed in 9/11 had signed his retirement papers that morning, but instead of leaving his badge, John William Perry decided to pick it up one last time. Here's a photo of Pork Chop the search dog receiving fluids and comfort before returning to his duties. Many 9/11 rescue dogs were becoming depressed because they weren't finding any live bodies. Rescue workers had to constantly bury themselves to trick the dogs into thinking they were actually saving someone. Tanya Head was a well-known 9/11 survivor who faked being in the South Tower during the attacks. She served as president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network for years until it was revealed she wasn't even in the country on 9/11. Known as the Meteor, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the towers collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being recovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the roof of a nearby bank. And as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on top of a Manhattan rooftop more than a decade after the attacks. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up only damaging one office room, and he was the only person that died. Since 9/11, more than 40,000 people have been diagnosed with cancers and chronic illnesses linked to the toxic dust released when the towers collapsed, a debris cloud made up of pulverized concrete, asbestos, fuel, and materials from office equipment and lighting systems. More first responders have died from 9/11 related illnesses than on the actual day of 9/11. Even nearly 25 years after the attacks, victims of 9/11 are still being identified. In 2025, 3 more people were named through advanced DNA testing, using tiny fragments recovered from the World Trade Center site. But of the 2,977 victims, 1,100 of them still have no identified remains. Amid the darkest day in modern history, these are the miracles of 9/11 that still leave people speechless. After nearly 27 hours buried under debris, Janelle Guzman McMillan, an office worker in the North Tower, was the last person rescued alive from Ground Zero. Pinned under concrete with only a single hand free, she said she felt someone holding it and telling her that she would be okay. When rescuers finally pulled her out, they all swore that none of them had touched her hand. In the North Tower's Stairwell B, a group of 16 firefighters, a police officer, and a civilian survived the entire collapse, entombed in a concrete pocket while everything around them was pulverized. They were dug out hours later still alive in what rescuers called a miracle. One survivor, Stanley Premnath, was literally looking at the nose of Flight 175 as it struck the South Tower. His office was completely shredded, but he survived by diving under his desk. He was later pulled from the rubble by another worker, both escaping down the stairwell before the building collapsed. A Port Authority worker named Pasquale Buzelli was on the 22nd floor of the North Tower when it suddenly collapsed beneath him. But instead of being crushed, he was carried down with the debris, riding it like a wave. He woke up hours later on top of a pile of rubble with only a broken ankle, later nicknamed the 9/11 Surfer. A guide dog named Roselle led a group of people, including her blind owner, down 78 flights of stairs before the North Tower collapsed. She stopped only once to give kisses to a woman who was having a panic attack. Florida High School principal Dr. George Kenny built a devoted following by hypnotizing students to boost confidence and performance despite not being licensed. But in 2011, 3 teens he had worked with died within months of each other, 1 in a car crash and 2 by suicide, raising alarm from families who believed the hypnosis may have caused psychological harm. Investigators never proved a direct link to the deaths, but Kenny was charged with practicing hypnosis without a license, pleaded no contest, and resigned in 2012. Lawsuits from the victims' families ended in settlements, while Kenny quietly left Florida and withdrew from public life, leaving the controversy unresolved. John C. Woods, the U.S. Army hangman who carried out the executions of Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, completely lied about his qualifications to get the job, claiming prior experience as an executioner when none of it could later be verified. As a result of his incompetence, several condemned Nazi officials did not die from a clean neck break, which is the intended outcome of a properly calculated drop. Instead, multiple prisoners slowly strangled in agony, some taking up to 20 minutes to die while witnesses observed visible suffering. Despite complaints from observers, Woods continued performing executions and was never formally disciplined for the botched hangings. In 1993, Sicilian mafia boss Giovanni Brusca ordered the kidnapping of 12-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo to silence his father, a former mob insider who had begun cooperating with authorities. Disguised as police, captors lured the boy away, promising to reunite him with his dad. He was held for 779 days in degrading conditions, often caged, beaten, underfed, and moved between hideouts, while photos of his suffering were sent to pressure his father into silence. When testimony continued, Brusca ordered the kill, dismissing the boy as the puppy. Giuseppe was strangled and his body dissolved in acid to erase all evidence. The murder shocked Italy because it shattered the long-promoted myth that the mafia followed a code of honor that spared all children. But investigators in later trials revealed that this was never truly a rule, and Giuseppe's death became one of the most disturbing symbols of the mafia's retaliation tactics during the 1990s crackdowns. In 2019, police uncovered an abuse case at the Danby House nursing home in North Carolina after staff were caught recording and encouraging violent confrontations between elderly residents with dementia. Investigators said workers laughed, filmed, and allegedly urged a 73-year-old man to attack a 70-year-old woman, shouting instructions like punch her in the face while she cried for help. Both residents required constant care and couldn't fully understand what was happening, turning a supervised environment into exploitation for entertainment. The footage led to criminal charges and renewed scrutiny over how vulnerable patients in long-term care facilities can be manipulated by caregivers. Just last week, a college party clip blew up online after looks-maxing streamer Clavicular got brutally frame-mogged by an ASU frat lord standing beside him with zero effort, the camera angle draining his aura in real time. The posture diff locked him into a ruthless side-by-side that spread across feeds like wildfire. The moment triggered instant cortisol spikes and total aura collapse, while the frat leader named Varys leaned into the attention, jester maxing across campus and dropping the nonchalant gimmick that made the clip go viral. Themes across the internet quickly flooded the timeline, going full goon max over every micro-expression like it was a historical artifact, reposting the same frozen frame until it became the only canon version people recognized. Edits kept looping, glaze levels stayed high, and the posture diff turned into permanent lore. What should have been a forgettable party interaction became a snapshot the algorithm refused to let die, slowly reshaping Clavicular's image into a meme defined by one cursed angle. She endured abortion after abortion until her body could no longer take it. In 2017, a woman in eastern China reportedly died after undergoing 4 abortions in a single year, each one carried out under pressure from her husband, who was determined to have a son. When every pregnancy resulted in a girl, he insisted she terminate, ignoring the strain it put on her health. After the 4th procedure, her body gave out and she succumbed to the damage. A grim reminder of how cultural obsession with male heirs can turn deadly. In 2012, 14-year-old Cassidy Goodson from Florida was hiding a dark secret that would only come to light in the most horrifying way. After secretly giving birth in her bathroom, she used a pair of scissors to cut the cord, then strangled the newborn to death and hid his body inside a shoebox. Days later, her mother noticed a foul odor coming from Cassidy's room, opened the box, and made the shocking discovery before calling police. As a juvenile, Cassidy pleaded guilty to manslaughter, receiving just 18 months in detention and probation for a life she tried so desperately to erase. In 2011, police in South Korea discovered the body of a 58-year-old man inside an abandoned quarry in a scene that looked eerily like a crucifixion. He was found on a wooden cross wearing a crown of thorns and flanked by two smaller crosses with tools, written plans, and a tent nearby. After investigators reconstructed the event, they concluded that it was a carefully staged act he had carried out himself, and the death was officially ruled a suicide as the man had apparently crucified himself. In November of 2022, 7-year-old Athena Strand was struck by a FedEx delivery van while playing in her Texas driveway, but she survived the impact with only minor injuries. But instead of calling for help, the driver, 31-year-old Tanner Lynn Horner, panicked after Athena said she was going to tell her father, took her inside his van, and murdered her. Court documents state he first tried to break her neck, and when that failed, strangled her with his bare hands while she was still alive. He then drove around for hours and dumped her body near the Trinity River, returning to work as if nothing had happened. Athena's disappearance sparked a massive search, and her body was found 2 days later after Horner confessed and led police to the location. He was charged with capital murder and kidnapping, with prosecutors seeking the harshest possible sentence. At just 8 years old, future UFC champion Ronda Rousey lived through a nightmare most fans never hear about. Her father, Ron Rousey, suffered a brutal sledding accident that shattered his back and left doctors warning him that he would slowly lose all mobility, develop a deadly blood disorder, and die in agonizing decline. Unable to face a future of paralysis and hopelessness, he made a devastating decision. He drove out alone one night and took his own life, leaving his wife and daughters behind. Ronda has said the trauma never left her, and that her rage, toughness, and kill or be killed mentality in the cage were born from that loss. In 2014, a Ryanair flight issued 3 warnings telling passengers not to eat nuts because a 4-year-old girl on board had a life-threatening nut allergy. One passenger ignored them, opened a packet of nuts anyway, and the girl almost immediately went into anaphylactic shock. Her tongue swelled, she turned blue, and briefly lost consciousness as crew scrambled to inject adrenaline and prepare for an emergency landing, all because one idiotic passenger couldn't resist a snack. The girl barely survived, and the airline banned the selfish passenger for 2 years. These are some of the most disturbing things that were found in the rubble of the Twin Towers. In the wreckage, workers found a fragment of a Bible literally fused to a slab of steel by the fire and pressure. Eerily, it was open to the verse, "An eye for an eye, but I say to you, resist not evil." Amid the ash and twisted metal, investigators recovered a hijacker's passport, lying intact on the sidewalk near the burning towers. It belonged to Satam al-Sukami of Flight 11, and was handed to police by a passerby just minutes before the South Tower collapsed. The fragile document's survival amid destruction has fueled many conspiracy theories, though experts claim that light objects can be blown clear by the force of a crash. Known as the meteor, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the buildings collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Rescue crews uncovered 2 massive steel beams fused together in the shape of a cross. The so-called Ground Zero Cross became a powerful religious symbol preserved today at the 9/11 Memorial. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being uncovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the rooftop of a nearby bank, and as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on a Manhattan rooftop over a decade after the attacks. Beneath the rubble, archaeologists found the remains of an 18th century wooden ship, preserved under the World Trade Center site for centuries until the tower's collapse exposed it. Out of the 40,000 windows within the Twin Towers, only one of them survived 9/11. It's believed to have come from the 82nd floor of the South Tower, one of the 9 floors that was struck by the second plane. Here's a photo of a 71-year-old man in profound distress outside a burning residential complex in Hong Kong on November 26, 2025, after telling reporters his wife was trapped inside as smoke and flames engulfed the high-rise towers. The blaze began in the afternoon at a nearby housing estate and quickly spread through bamboo scaffolding and flammable renovation materials, consuming 7 of the 8 apartment blocks and sending dark plumes of smoke into the sky. Authorities later confirmed the fire became one of the deadliest residential blazes in Hong Kong history, with the final official death toll reaching 168 people, including a firefighter. In 2003, at the Toledo Hospital in Ohio, a man named Paul Fudach Jr. donated one of his kidneys to save the life of his sister, Sarah. Surgeons successfully removed the healthy organ and placed it in a sterile container as they prepared for the transplant. But while it sat unattended outside the operating room, a nurse found the container, did not realize it held a donated human kidney, and mistakenly threw the $250,000 organ into a medical waste bin. By the time the error was discovered, the kidney had been contaminated and had to be destroyed. Paul had undergone major surgery for nothing, and Sarah lost her chance at a life-saving transplant. She did finally receive a donor kidney months later as the hospital admitted fault, paid a settlement, and rewrote the organ handling procedures after the incident. He didn't want to die alone, so in 2003, 56-year-old Kim Dae-han did the unthinkable. After suffering a stroke and sinking into despair, he carried containers of flammable liquid onto a crowded South Korean subway train and lit them on fire. Within minutes, the underground station was an inferno, one train engulfed in flames, another trapped behind sealed doors as the smoke choked hundreds of passengers. By the time rescuers gained control, 192 passengers were dead, and hundreds more were injured in South Korea's worst disaster in peacetime history. Kim, badly burned but alive, ended up fleeing the scene, only to be captured, sentenced to life, and die alone in prison the following year. Since my Hiroshima video sparked a lot of debate, I think it's only fair that we take a look at some of the most horrific things Japan did during World War II, each one darker than the last. Before the atomic bombings, Japan had planned for a horrific biological attack on California. Submarines would launch planes to drop fleas infected with bubonic plague over San Diego, hoping to trigger mass death and chaos across the U.S. Scheduled for September 1945, it was only halted when Japan surrendered weeks earlier, narrowly preventing one of history's deadliest biological attacks. During the war, Japan's military forced tens of thousands of women, many as young as teenagers, into sexual slavery. Known as comfort women, they were trapped in military brothels, raped by dozens of soldiers each day, and often left broken by disease, pregnancy, or suicide. Survivors who later spoke out described it as a daily death they were forced to endure for years. When Japanese troops invaded Nanjing in 1937, the city descended into 6 weeks of unrestrained horror. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were executed, often by machine guns, bayonets, or mass burnings. Up to 80,000 women were systematically raped, sometimes murdered immediately after, and sometimes mutilated as a warning to others. Eyewitnesses described rivers flooded with corpses and roads so littered with bodies that walking became impossible without stepping on the dead. And perhaps the most horrific of all, Japan's Secret Unit 731 in Manchuria carried out some of the most sadistic experiments in history, using men, women, and even children as disposable test subjects. Some prisoners were deliberately infected with painfully deadly viruses, then dissected alive without anesthesia so doctors could study how the diseases destroyed living organs in real time. Others were tied to stakes while grenades or flamethrowers were tested on them, or left outside in sub-zero cold until their flesh blackened with frostbite, before doctors hacked off limbs one by one to see how long they could survive. Some had their arms amputated and reattached to the other side of their body, while others had their entire skin slowly peeled off to see how long it would take them to die. In all, tens of thousands of people were killed through torture disguised as science, and not a single test subject ever made it out alive. Perhaps most shocking of all, many of the doctors who oversaw these experiments walked free after the war, trading their horrific research to America in exchange for immunity.